Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really significant slice of history, British colonial policy and administration, roughly between 1914 and 1967.
Yeah, think of it as your quick route to getting your head around a pretty pivotal era for the British Empire.
Our scope is, well, it's quite broad. We're looking at how Britain handled things in India, Palestine, Iraq, and also the Dominions.
hmm And the big question running through it all is this tension, this interplay between continuity, what stayed the same, and, well, the huge changes that were happening because of all the pressures of the 20th century.
Exactly. And we know you, our listener, want to grasp this complex stuff quickly but also thoroughly, so that's the plan. Let's dive straight into India, really a cornerstone of the empire, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The period around the World Wars,
Yep.
and in between them, you saw this massive groundswell of nationalist feeling there.
A real buildup of pressure.
Definitely. And the British, well, they responded with things like the Government of India Act of 1919.
Okay, let's unpack that. It brought in something called diarchy.
That's right. Diarchy. Basically, a kind of shared power system. Some areas were run by Indian ministers, others, the really key ones, stayed under British control.
So it sounds like a step towards Indian involvement on the surface. But, what was the reality?
Well, that's the crucial bit. It looked like progress, maybe,
Mm.
but the right to vote, still incredibly restricted. Only about 7 million Indians out of, well, a huge population.
So it wasn't really handing over the reins.
Not at all. It made sure the British kept a firm grip on the important stuff. So change, yes, but also real continuity of control.
Right, more like a change in packaging, perhaps. That sort of top-down approach seems obvious with the Simon Commission later on in the late 20s, supposedly reviewing that 1919 Act.
hmm And here's the thing that really tells you a lot. No Indian members were included on that commission. Zero.
Wow, okay. You can imagine the reaction.
Exactly. I mean, for you, the listener, think about how insulting that would feel. It just laid bare Britain's paternalistic attitude, this idea they knew best. Unsurprisingly, it sparked widespread protests.
And that leads into the Round Table conferences in the early 30s. Sounds better, British and Indian leaders actually talking at the same table.
It sounds like dialogue, yeah. And they were talking, but, the real power to actually make changes, that stayed firmly in London. The pace of any genuine reform was just glacial. It really underlined that continuity of British authority despite the talks.
Okay, but then the Government of India Act of 1935. This one feels different, doesn't it? Diarchy's out.
It is. Provinces got more autonomy.
Direct elections were introduced,
hmm
and the number of voters jumps massively from 7 million up to 35 million. That's huge.
It's a significant jump, absolutely. Plus, you get the Reserve Bank of India established. So yes, on paper, big changes.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
There usually is with this stuff. Crucially, Britain kept control over defense and foreign affairs. The core power, the ultimate say, remained British. So you see that pattern again, real change happening alongside persistent, fundamental continuity.
And then World War II hits. Surely that was the game changer.
Oh, absolutely. The war just threw the contradictions of British rule into sharp relief. It became, well, unsustainable.
How so?
Well, India contributed massively to the war effort, troops, resources. Yet back home, no real democracy, no self-rule. It was a glaring inconsistency.
Plus Gandhi's civil disobedience.
Exactly. His campaign in 1940 was hugely powerful. Add to that Britain being severely weakened financially and militarily by the war itself. Indian independence, by the end of the war, it just felt inevitable, a truly massive change.
Okay, so India shows this really complex picture, gradual, often limited reforms, but always that British hand on the tiller until the pressure just became too immense. Let's shift focus now to Palestine, a different dynamic, but still about that Imperial Balancing Act. Its location was key from the start, right?
Totally key. Palestine sits right next to the Suez Canal.
Well, lifeline to India.
Precisely. That canal was the vital artery for trade for moving troops. So controlling Palestine, or at least influencing it heavily, was about protecting that route.
Yeah.
A clear continuity of old-school imperial priorities.
Yeah.
Secure the trade routes.
And we see attempts to set up a government, like High Commissioner Herbert Samuel in 1920, but it wasn't smooth sailing.
Far from it. What's really interesting and kind of reveals a typical imperial problem was the division within the British administration.
How do you mean?
Well, you had officials back in London who often leaned more towards supporting Zionist Jewish aspirations. But the officials actually in Palestine, on the ground, they often tended to be more sympathetic to the Arab population and their concerns.
So conflicting signals.
Conflicting signals internal disagreements
Right.
and this tendency to kind of impose solutions based on external British interests rather than local realities, it often just created more division, which is unfortunately a continuity you see elsewhere too.
Then you have this huge surge in Jewish immigration, especially, tragically, driven by Nazi persecution in Europe. The population shift must have been dramatic.
It was stark. Look at the figures. 1931, the Jewish population was about 17%. Fast forward to 1946, it's up to 30%.
Doubled, almost.
Pretty much doubled in 15 years. That's a massive demographic change in a short time, and, well, it inevitably fueled growing Arab resistance and fear.
And the British response? The Peel Report in 1937 recommended partition, dividing the land. That sounds like a major potential shift.
It was a radical proposal for the time, yeah. A big change in thinking, acknowledging maybe that the two communities' claims couldn't easily be reconciled under one roof.
But it didn't happen?
Nope. It faced really strong Arab opposition, and ultimately, the British backed away from implementing it, which highlights another continuity. Britain struggling, and often failing, to impose solutions that could stick, that had local buy-in.
So, after the partition idea failed, they tried limiting Jewish immigration in 1939, trying to put a lid on things.
That was the idea. Set a quota of 15,000 Jewish immigrants a year for 5 years. An attempt to kind of manage the situation, dial down the tensions.
Did it work?
Not really. The underlying violence just kept escalating. You had militant groups like the Stern Gang carrying out attacks, leading tragically to the assassination of Lord Moyne, a British minister. It really showed that British control was fraying, breaking down.
And the end result, Britain basically throws its hands up and gives the problem to the United Nations in 1947.
Pretty much. A clear admission, really, that they couldn't solve it, couldn't manage it anymore. That's a major change, handing over responsibility like that.
And the UN had its own plan.
It did. Another partition plan. Separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem as an international city. But again, tragically, war broke out before it could be properly implemented, so you end up with this bitter continuity of instability and unresolved conflict.
Wow. Okay. India and Palestine show such different pressures, but similar themes of struggle and control. Let's move to Iraq. Britain gets involved there after World War I, right? After the Ottoman Empire collapses.
Yes, exactly. Britain took control of the Ottoman provinces that became Iraq, initially under League of Nations mandate. So it wasn't technically a colony in the old sense, more like a trusteeship Britain was overseeing. A definite change from Ottoman rule.
But this new British oversight wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. That 1920 Iraqi revolt sounds serious.
Oh, it was very serious, a major challenge. You had religious leaders issuing fatwas against non-Muslim rule, plus Kurdish groups in the north pushing for their own independence.
And the British response?
Forceful, very forceful, unfortunately. Estimates are around 10,000 Iraqis were killed putting down the revolt. It's a grim example, but it shows the continuity of Britain relying on military power to maintain control when faced with resistance.
But then they seem to try a different approach with the Cairo Conference in 1921, installing an Iraqi king, Faisal Mess.
That was the idea. Create a sort of Iraqi self-rule, at least in appearance. So putting Faisal on the throne looked like a step towards independence, a change.
But only in appearance.
Well, let's just say Britain still pulled the strings. They had huge influence over major decisions. They controlled the military. And Faisal himself was essentially their choice. He owed his position to them. So yeah, a continuity of ultimate British control beneath the surface.
And the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1922 formalized this kind of setup.
Pretty much. It recognized Faisal as king, but the reality was British advisors were embedded everywhere, effectively running the government, running the military. It was a kind of puppet leadership, you could say. That continuity of influence just masked a bit.
Fast forward to the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1930. This sounds more like actual independence is on the cards.
It was definitely framed as preparation for independence, a shift towards it.
Yeah.
But crucially, Britain made sure to keep hold of its military bases there and retain significant influence over Iraq's foreign policy.
Yeah.
So yes, a move towards change, but with major strings attached, ensuring British strategic interests, that continuity, remained protected.
And then independence itself, in 1932, the mandate officially ends. That sounds like a clean break.
Formally, yes. The mandate was over. Iraq was independent. But but Britain kept control over the really valuable stuff, the oil, through the Iraq Petroleum Company.
Of course.
They kept their military bases. They continued to wield considerable political influence behind the scenes. So it was independence, but a rather limited version. The continuity of British economic and strategic power was very much intact.
You mentioned Gertrude Bell earlier. In the context of Iraq, why is she significant here?
Ah, Bell. She's a fascinating figure. A woman wielding considerable political influence in that part of the world at that time, which was unusual. She was a strong advocate for the Hashemites, for Faisal. So her prominent role itself maybe represents a small change, a crack in the usual gender roles in British foreign policy.
But ultimately, whose interests did her work serve?
Well, that's the key, isn't it? Despite her deep knowledge of the region, her connections, her writings, the policies she helped shape, her support for Faisal, they ultimately aligned with and served British imperial objectives.
Keeping Iraq stable under a friendly ruler.
Exactly. Her extensive knowledge, her maps, her books, they were even used by the British military. And she became Oriental Secretary, effectively part of the British administration there. So while she was unique in some ways, her work reinforced British influence, a continuity of purpose, maybe using slightly different, more informed methods.
Okay, so across India, Palestine, and Iraq, we see these varied tactics, reforms, mandates, installing rulers, but always aiming to maintain control. What about the dominions? Places like Canada, Australia, the relationship there seemed different.
It was different, yes. These were the older white settler colonies. And by 1931, with the creation of the Commonwealth, there's a formal recognition of their independence. South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada.
So that's a definite change. They're independent nations now.
Officially, yes. A major change in their legal and political status relative to Britain.
But Britain didn't just want to cut ties completely, did they?
No, not at all. The Commonwealth was, in a way, a clever move to maintain influence, but informally. Through shared culture, history, economic ties, defense cooperation, Britain aimed to keep a sort of leadership role, even without direct political control, a continuity of seeking influence, just through different, softer means.
And the Statute of Westminster, same year, 1931, that gave them actual legal freedom.
It did. It basically said the Dominion parliaments could pass their own laws without Britain being able to override them. A huge step, real legislative independence. That's a significant change.
I sense another but coming.
To sense correctly, the crucial limitation here, and it tells you a lot about the mindset, is that the Statute of Westminster only applied to those white majority dominions.
Not India, not other colonies.
No, India, Iraq, the African colonies. They were explicitly excluded. So it reveals this stark continuity of, frankly, discriminatory practices within the empire. Freedom and autonomy weren't granted equally.
Right. Okay, let's pull back a bit and look at the bigger picture imperial defense across this whole period. Britain's economic situation sounds like it was getting shaky.
Increasingly so. Between 1914 and 1947, Britain faced massive economic headwinds. You had the Great Depression, which hammered world trade. Britain even had to come off the gold standard, a huge symbolic blow.
And the wars must have cost a fortune.
An absolute fortune. World War II, especially. National debt just skyrocketed, reaching something like 240% of GDP, a completely different economic reality compared to the strength Britain had before World War I. That's major change.
Yet they're still trying to hold on to this massive global empire.
They are. Despite the financial strain getting worse and worse, the commitment, the idea of the empire persisted. That continuity was driven by, strategic thinking, national prestige, the idea of being a global power, but the cost was becoming crippling.
And militarily, the threats were changing too, weren't they? New powers rising.
Big time. You had Imperial Japan expanding aggressively in Asia, Manchuria, later Singapore, Hong Kong. You had fascist Italy under Mussolini pushing into Africa like Abyssinia.
And then Nazi Germany in Europe.
Exactly. Germany defeating France and the Netherlands so quickly was a massive shock. These weren't just colonial skirmishes. These were modern, powerful, militarized states challenging Britain directly or indirectly across the globe. A fundamental change in the threat landscape.
But Britain still relied on the empire to face these threats.
Heavily. For troops, think of the Indian Army, soldiers from across the dominions and colonies, for resources, for strategic bases. That reliance, that continuity of using the empire as a resource, remained, even as the threats grew much more dangerous.
And meanwhile, inside the empire, the pressure for independence is building up everywhere.
Yes, nationalism wasn't just an Indian phenomenon. Movements were gaining strength across Asia, Africa, the Middle East. More demands, more organized resistance, sometimes outright rebellion.
Requiring more British troops to keep order.
Exactly. Which cost more money and tied down resources they desperately needed elsewhere. It was a change in the intensity of internal pressure. But the initial British reaction for a long time was the old continuity. Try to suppress it, manage it, contain it, until it became clear that it just wasn't working anymore, or was simply too expensive.
What about appeasement in the 1930s? Giving concessions to Hitler, that seems like a shift away from assertive empire defense.
It was, in a way. It reflected a reluctance, maybe an inability to face another massive war. So they shifted towards diplomacy, making concessions, hoping to pacify aggressors like Hitler. There was also a misplaced reliance, perhaps, on the League of Nations to solve disputes peacefully.
A move away from just using force.
A move away from automatically resorting to force, yes. But the underlying goal, the continuity, was still about protecting the empire. Appeasement was seen, rightly or wrongly, as the best way to avoid a war that could shatter the empire. They just lacked the confidence, maybe the strengths, for direct confrontation on multiple fronts at that point.
And then World War II happens anyway, and the defense system seems to just crumble in places.
It was devastating. The fall of France and the Netherlands in 1940 left Britain dangerously exposed. But the real symbolic shattering blow was the fall of Singapore to the Japanese in 1942.
The impregnable fortress.
Exactly. Its loss was a massive humiliation and a clear, undeniable sign that British power was declining. That was a profound change in perception, both for Britain and for people within the empire.
And you even had forces like the Indian National Army fighting against the British.
Yes, collaborating with Japanese.
Right.
That showed a completely different dynamic of resistance, turning imperial subjects into active enemies supported by a rival power. It highlighted just how fragile British control had become in some areas.
So the war basically proved the empire in its old form was unaffordable and maybe indefensible.
I think that's fair to say. Britain still fought incredibly hard to defend its territories and ultimately won the war. But the conflict made it brutally clear that maintaining that vast global empire afterwards, in the face of all these pressures, economic weakness, rising nationalism, a changed world order, was just not feasible anymore. A profound, irreversible change.
Right. So as we wrap up this deep dive, looking at British colonial policy from 1914 right through to 1967, it's really striking, isn't it? This constant battle between trying to hold on the continuity and the forces pushing for change.
Absolutely. We've seen across India, Palestine, Iraq, even the Dominions, Britain constantly trying to adapt, trying new strategies, reforms, different models of control, the
Yeah.
diarchy, mandates, treaties, the Commonwealth.
But often, underneath those changes, the fundamental aim was still to maintain British influence, British interests, right? That core continuity.
But as we saw, especially with the economic pressures and the sheer force of nationalism, amplified by two world wars, those efforts to adapt and maintain control became increasingly difficult and ultimately unsustainable. The sources really paint a picture of imperial power gradually but undeniably weakening.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed, this complex dance of continuity and change, the reforms, the resistance, the global shifts, what do you think were the most critical moments, the real turning points that made the eventual dismantling of the British Empire not just possible, but perhaps inevitable? Something to ponder.